So in this video, we're going to use something called Scriptable objects. You can search for them like this once we have made them. And under weapons, we'll have a couple of them, a hoe and a rod. And you're going to be able to say to the player, hey, player, your weapon in use is a hoe. And that hoe itself is going to have a concept of the prefab it needs. Later, it will have an attack animation specific to that weapon. And we can even start adding in things about the types of damage and combat attributes into this later as well. So the idea for now is that he doesn't start with a weapon in his hand, but when you tell the player that the weapon in use is a hoe, then note there's only one hoe in the scene right now. We play the game, and what's going to happen is the player is going to spawn another hoe right there, and then in the video after, we will focus on how to make it appear in the hand. Let's take control of these weapons then completely. So starting with the dirty old hoe, I'm going to drop it in the game scene, delete some random, oh, there's another dirty old hoe there. So there's two on top of each other. That's because that's where their root position is. Let's fix that. So if we drop dirty old hoe in the scene, we don't want it to be over there. I think for the moment, I don't know where Rick wants it, but we probably want it next to the player. And I'm just going to pop it down there. We also don't want the dirty old hoe in the player's hands anymore because we want to be able to switch this puppy out programmatically, don't we? We need to be able to change weapons. So I'm preparing you for being able to hit other enemies. To do that, I want a couple of different enemy weapon types, colliders on the weapons, various things. So going to take the player for a start, breaking the player's prefab instance by ripping the weapon mercilessly out of his hand. I'm then going to overwrite the player prefab from the scene there, and then we can just test that by redropping the player into the hierarchy. There he is. No weapon in hand. That's pretty cool. All right. Now, the dirty old hoe itself, what's the issue with that? One issue with it is it has no colliders on it. It has not got a snowball's chance in hell of doing any damage right now. Also, I think that if we're going to show it off, should probably be a bit higher above the ground. So lift it up, apply that back to the prefab. So let's just deal with a couple of colliders. So let's add ourselves a box collider to the handle and then just decide, well, that's probably all right. I'm actually going to suggest that I want it to be, the box collider itself, to be a little different. I don't want it to be down at that end. I only want to do damage like halfway down it. So I think I'm just going to make the Y size about half, about 0.8, and then just drag its position like so to there. Just rough and ready. Then on the head, I'm also going to add a box collider. By default, that actually looks pretty good. I think if you got anywhere in that volume, you would be in trouble with that dirty old hoe. So now we have box colliders on the dirty old hoe. Wicked. Let's apply that back to the prefab. And again, you should always be able to delete things in this scene. So don't be afraid to do that. Drop it back in the scene. There it is. Cool. So the box collider has got some damage ability now. So let's make ourselves a new weapon as well. Let's just call it the Rod of Death or something like that. Rod of Death. It's going to be a weapon composed of primitives at this point because I don't have the assets, just because I want two weapons. This whole idea of switching weapons doesn't really make any sense unless we've got two weapons, does it? So we're going to create an empty child object here, or maybe it's quicker just to make ourselves a cylinder. There it is. Let's child the cylinder to the Rod of Death. Let's just call it a cylinder. That's fine. Call a cylinder a cylinder. Rotate it round. Doesn't really matter what angle it's at. Funny, off is fine in this game, isn't it? It's all a game about weirdness. Let's make it a sensible size. Here's our Rod of Death. There you go. Now, it has nothing at the top level, just like the dirty old hoe. And then it has, at the next level down, it has mesh filters, mesh renderers, and it needs a box collider. Possibly no material. If we want, we could slap some, say, wood on it like that, would be fine. And now let's make sure that this guy has a cylinder collider. It has a capsule collider. That is good enough for our Rod of Death. And I think we want to move that capsule collider just along it a little bit if possible. So let's move it along the Y and then just make it a little bit smaller, just so that the end that the player's holding doesn't have too much of a chance of colliding with the player. All right, so the player now has two weapons of choice. He has a Rod of Death, which I am going to make into a prefab here, and he has himself a dirty old hoe. The other thing that we're going to need with a weapon, for each weapon, is a different animation. With the Rod of Death, he may step 1 foot forward and kind of thrust the rod forward with both hands, whereas with the dirty old hoe, he may swing it wildly with one hand or whatever he chooses to do. But each weapon is going to need its own animation. So how are we going to tie the weapon to its animation? Well, lots of ways we could do it, but what I'm going to suggest is we create a whole new type of object, a whole new type of weapon. So if you just naively create a weapon script, and you're welcome to do this, just call it weapon, C# script in the weapons folder. Let's just open that script and just look at something a little bit critically. What does this guy have? Well, the top two namespaces, system namespaces, are not being used, but Unity Engine is. Why? Quick micro quiz for you. What is it about this code that means that Unity Engine is being used? It's black. It means it's being used. Well, it's mono behavior. If weapon wasn't inheriting from mono behavior, then we wouldn't need Unity Engine. Indeed, the fact that it inherits from mono behavior is why the start and update methods ever get called. They're called callbacks, and they get called because they are called on all mono behaviors that are on game objects in the scene. So, a few terms for you then. Data versus state. We are going to be talking about the fact that data is basically stuff that ships with a game. Tying the animation to the weapon prefab, that's data. Tweaking how much damage a weapon does, that's data. Tweaking an enemy's health value, data. State is stuff that's created during the gameplay by the player's actions, and that's something we're later going to want to save the progress, but for now we can throw away because we don't care about saving progress. So you normally make a script and you just slap a mono behavior on things. Now, in the resources, I've given you a link to a YouTube video called The Mono Behavior Tyranny by a Unity employee. Take a little look at that if you wish, and it'll explain why if you just keep slapping mono behaviors on things, it creates a bit of problems. It's very heavy for a start. A mono behavior, if you look at the docs, inherits from a behavior. It takes all the methods from behavior, which in turn inherits from component, and that's where it gets things like its transform, and eventually that inherits from object. Whereas a scriptable object inherits directly from object. Still serializable, can still be saved as a file, saved to disk, and it can also do something very special, which I'll show you in a moment. So basically the decision is if we don't need a transform, then we don't need to have, on the particular component in question, then we don't need a mono behavior. We don't need a transform to define how our weapon works, because the weapon sits in the hand. The transform of the weapon is dictated by the player's hand. So we're going to go for a scriptable object. Another view on this is, what do you inherit from for various different purposes? Well, if you have something like a future version of camera raycaster.find top priority hit, if that's pure logic, which it could be, you actually don't need to inherit from anything. We can have a base class for pure logical questions. So for logic, we inherit from nothing. For data, we want to start thinking about inheriting from scriptable objects, and we'll be doing a lot more of this as the course goes on. Things like the enemy type attributes or the weapon.cs, whatever. And if you're doing plumbing like the camera follow script, where we're having to deal with plumbing our data, our stuff into engine information like positions of cameras, etc., then you want to be using mono behaviors. But let's not always use mono behaviors. That's the basic takeaway from what I'm saying here. So how do we make a weapon scriptable object? Well, firstly, you inherit from scriptable object, and immediately you do that, get rid of your callbacks because they ain't going to be called anyway. So now we have something of type weapon. Now, what I'm going to use this weapon for is to connect a game object, which is called the weapon prefab. My nice new member variable highlighting. Why do I care about that? Well, just because I like to know whether I'm dealing with member variables or local variables to a particular method. And another thing that we're going to want here is the attack animation. So it is an animation clip in the Unity namespace, and then it's the attack animation. Okay, so we're going to tie those two things together using this weapon here. And is there anything else we need? Well, at some point we're going to need to know how much damage this weapon does, etc. But let's just get the big picture for the moment. So if you make yourself a script like that, okay, you don't need these two namespaces at the top. I'm going to leave them because we're almost certainly going to use general C# stuff later. But it's just saying they're not currently being used. So if you have that, then, well, how do you make one of these things? How do you instantiate one of these scriptable objects? Well, this is when we get to this particular new annotation that I'm going to teach you called Create Assets Menu. So let me just put that down the bottom of the screen for you like that, and then get back into the script. What we want to use is this annotation, Create Asset Menu, and then menu name equals, and then we're going to go, in my case, weapon. Okay. Oh, we could say RPG /weapon. I think it's /. It might be /. Probably /. Let's try /. Okay. So if we do that, what does this do? Well, let's go back into our weapons folder. Unrecognized escape sequence /. Let's try /. Let it compile. Create menu. So right click in assets, create menu. What do we get now? Do we get ourselves an RPG sub menu here? No, that's what I was hoping would happen. Maybe we need to wait another few seconds. Yes, at the top we have RPG weapon. So we're going to create ourselves a weapon scriptable object. Let's call it HO. Let's make another one called rod. Okay, now it's time to organize this stuff. Then we'll look at what those things are. So create yourself a folder for the hoe, put the hoe Blender file, the hoe prefab, and the whole scriptable object all in there, and then the same with the rod. Folder for the rod, scriptable object, the rod of death, and I think that's actually all that applies there. Okay, that is pretty cool, and then the rest of these things are common. So what are these scriptable objects then? What is this rod.asset? Well, if we were to look at that rod.asset, is it going to let me do that? I may have to show it in Finder and then just open it. It's just a text file that is going to contain all the data that we have about rod. So that's all it is. It's yet another markup language, a YAML file. Okay, and that's going to contain all the data about the rod. So the rod's going to need a weapon prefab. Well, that's the rod of death. That's simple. And it's going to need an animation clip. So I'm just going to go grab that animation clip from third-person character animation. And under humanoid, jump up. One of these, the second one in, I think. If you don't have an avatar down here, drag Ethan into this box and you'll get one. I'm just going to use a jump up animation for now. Anything just to have an animation for attacking. Actually, to be honest, we're not even using that animation yet, so I'm not even going to assign it. Mikey may have made us a decent animation before that. But the point is to show you that what we're doing here with the rod is that we are specifying the weapon prefab and an attack animation. Let's not worry about the attack animation for the moment, but every weapon will need a different animation. The player will move differently depending on which weapon he's using, right? So now what we want to do is place the weapon in the player's hand programmatically. So how are we going to do that? So instead of the weapon just appearing in the player's hand, what we need to do is modify the player a little bit. So let's just go into characters, not characters there, but characters at the top level, player, and let's expose ourselves a new thing. Let's serialize ourselves a weapon. And weapon in use. Let's not initialize it for the moment, okay? So by default, the player now will not have any particular weapon in use. But what we want to be able to do on the player is we want to be able to make the player instantiate a particular weapon that we have supplied. So you see weapon in use down here. What we want to be able to do there is go to weapons and pick the scriptable object, because remember, weapon is of type scriptable object. We want to be able to drop hoe in there, and then we click play. We want the hoe to appear in the player's hands, which it currently isn't doing. Okay, so that's going to be your challenge. So what I want you to do is make the weapon appear in the player's hand. Instantiate the weapon in the hand, and don't worry about position or rotation for now. It should be vaguely near the hand, hopefully, but not to worry too much about the position and the rotation. No fine-tuning of that. We'll be doing that in a subsequent video. So go ahead, pause the video. See if you can make that happen now. All right, welcome back. So what we need to do then is in the player script, we need to, on start, we're doing a couple of things. Firstly, let's refactor start a little bit. These two things here, what do they do? Well, let's do a refactor, extract a method, and I think that those two things collectively register for mouse click. So that's that. Then we set the maximum health points. That's simple and self-explanatory. Then what we want to do in general terms, we want to make ourselves a method called something like put weapon in hand. Now, if you just write a method wishfully like that, better than a comment, right? You're going to get an error, but look how quickly you can get it compiling. Quick actions, generate method, boom. It throws a new not implemented exception. So let's see what happens there. If we try playing the game now, what we get, amongst our other couple of warnings, is the requested feature is not implemented, and it tells you exactly where. So it's trying, the player is trying on start to put a weapon in the hand, but it's throwing a exception. That's pretty cool, isn't it? That's really simple way of doing that. So you right-click a given method, and you refactor and create the method in Visual Studio, at least. Not sure there's the same thing in Xcode, I'm afraid. So how do we put the weapon in the hand? Well, the weapon in use is available up here, and that's of type weapon. Well, the first thing we need to do is make a way of getting the weapon from the weapon prefab from the weapon in use. So over on weapon, we can make ourselves a method, public get weapon prefab. And what's it going to return? Well, it's going to return a game object. Just a simple getter. Get weapon prefab. And then what that's going to return is return weapon prefab. Okay, so we have a method now on our weapon. So the player can say, okay, cool, how do we put the weapon in the hand? Well, instead of throwing a exception, let's start off by saying that some variable called the weapon prefab is the current weapon, or the, what did we call it, weapon in use, dot get weapon prefab. So that gives us the weapon prefab, whatever we've got in our hand. Then what we want to do is we want to make ourselves a weapon. So our weapon equals instantiate. Now, there are lots of signatures for instantiate. I think I'm just going to go for this one here. The original object is the weapon prefab, and the parent should be the hand. But for now I said don't worry about the position, so I'm just going to instantiate the weapon prefab and not care where on earth in the world it is. And I am going to make myself a to-do, move to correct place and child to hand, or we may do it round the other way. All right, I said let's not worry about it because this is enough in one go. The idea is that we put a weapon in the hand. So if we have our player sitting here, and if we inspect this player and he indeed has a weapon in use as hoe, and I click play, I'm just looking for there to be a hoe created somewhere, a new hoe somewhere created in the scene. So one way you can find that is to go to weapons, hoe, dirty old hoe prefab, and then you can say find references in scene. And where is that dirty old hoe? We need to be in the scene view to see it. Well, it's there. Now, is that a new one? No. So it looks like it has not instantiated on play a new dirty old hoe yet. So we need to check. Hang on. Weapon prefab has not been assigned. So what have I done wrong here? Weapon in use, instantiate weapon prefab, weapon in prefab, so get weapon prefab. That all looks good. Get weapon prefab returns the weapon prefab. So we want to make sure that the hoe scriptable object, you see it doesn't have a weapon prefab on it. Boom. All right, now the hoe has a weapon prefab on it. Should all filter through now. And somewhere in this scene, as I said before, we should, if we find references, we should have two of them now. And we do now have a second dirty old hoe. Where's the first one is here. There you go, right next to each other. They've sat on top of each other. So the dirty old hoe has just instantiated in its default position. Now, if I move the player around now, the hoe doesn't even go with him because it's not childed to his hand. But we are doing what we said we were going to do, which was instantiating a second dirty old hoe into the scene. It's not there now, by the way. It's only there at runtime when you play the game. Now, the other way to test this is to say, well, okay, how about if the rod knows that it has the rod of death? How about if the player... How about if we say that his current weapon is the rod? What happens? We play the game. Go to scene view, inspect the rod, and there should be two on top of each other, which there are. All right, the reason that's funny angle is because we're on local. So we are instantiating a weapon based on the scriptable object of the weapon that we have in our hand. Much, much, much more like it. All right, now we have just a weapon in use. We can double click through to that and find out all about that weapon in use. Big deep breath. Hopefully that's cool. Now this will all gel together even more tightly as we move forward and start using it. And now we're next going to look at how you get it in the right place with the right rotation.